Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you or see you. Thank you for taking time out to be with me. We're going to wait probably one more minute because we have a lot of people coming in, which is awesome. Okay, I think I'm all set. So welcome to Petting Elephants, Facilitating Difficult Topics in the Classroom. Again, I want to thank you for taking time to be with me today. I know that it's a really unusual time and we're probably fatigued for being online and virtual and whatnot, but again, I thank you for your time, attention, and energy. So just some logistical things before we get started. Most of us, I think we've gotten acclimated to our virtual world and we know to keep our mics muted. For this particular conversation, though, I do want to invite you to use the chat, but I also want to invite you to talk. And we'll talk about principles of engagement and whatnot as we move forward. So I want to start out by seeing who's in the room. I see names and I just kind of want to see who's all in the room. So I'm going to ask you to utilize the hand icon that you see on the top of your screen when I call out a specific group so I can see who's all here, who am I speaking to, because I really want to make sure that everybody gets something of value based on where you are and where you serve in the institution. So if you are a student, raise your hand. You have any students? No? Okay. Let's see. Awesome. Great. Welcome. So you can go ahead and you can put your hand down. If we have any staff, raise your hand. Staff? Wonderful. Great. Nice. Thank you very much. And you can put your hands down. Thank you. And then faculty, raise your hand. And I have like 3 monitors here, so I am present with you. I'm not doing anything else. Faculty? Awesome. Great. We got a good mix of people. Thank you. You can put your hands down. How about administrators? Any? Wonderful. All right. Thank you. Welcome. And lastly, other community members who would like to be recognized. I just want to make sure that we take tally of everybody in the room. Anyone else? And feel free to speak as well. Did we pretty much capture? Awesome. Welcome. Well, that helps me a lot. So I'm hoping that whatever I say here today is just brilliant enough to move, touch, and inspire you and transform you in some way as you move forward serving our students. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat. How are you entering this space? It is at 2:20. How's your day been going? 3 words to describe how you're entering the space. How do you feel? Proud. Yeah. Busy, productive, happy. Happy, chilly, loved. Yeah. Safe, cold, productive. Open, productive, calm, enlightened, proud, happy. cold, productive. Everybody's cold. There's a lot of temperature gauges here. Wonderful. Those of you who are writing and continuing to share will continue to monitor the chat, because I do open-minded, productive, and tired. Yeah, I kind of feel the open-minded, tired thing. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing. And we're going to go back to this and your words as we move forward. So before I get started, whenever I facilitate conversations, particularly conversations around difficult, and we'll unpack that later, topics, I always like to set guidelines for interaction. And some of you who've been a part of the Diversity Inclusion Foundations course, the training that we have on the district level, this is going to look a lot very familiar to you. Know that most of us who are diversity and inclusion practitioners, we do create these particular boundaries of interaction. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things. One thing is I want you to suspend the following things that are listed on your screen. So judgment, denial, shame, blame, guilt, assumptions, distractions, interruptions, side conversations, because they will stop the flow of what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, so what becomes available to us if we remove them for the space? What becomes available if we're fully present? And, in the 21st century, particularly because now that we're virtual, being present is a whole new world. And it's actually quite a gift and even a skill set to develop. And the next thing I'm going to ask you to embrace is confidentiality, awareness. Confidentiality is really big in terms of this is not a snitch session. The hope is that we'll get to the point in which we're going to share stories and ideas. And so we want to be discreet. We just want to focus on the opportunity to learn and less about the people. Okay. Being awareness toward your own understanding. Discomfort is part of learning. And that also comes with self-reflection and cognitive dissonance. Helping to create a safe space, or sometimes we call it a brave space. Opportunities to learn about our biases. And yes, we all have them, and I'll be sharing mine with yours. There's something very freeing about saying, this is how I built, this is how I'm wired, I'm working on it, work with me to help me, right? And that goes along with being vulnerable. And vulnerable, reworking the narrative around vulnerability is a really big thing when it comes to our students. Some of our students won't ask for help because we have a narrative that says there's something wrong with you if you need help, that, we're supposed to be strong and kind of tough it out. But what becomes available to us if we dissolve that and replace that with vulnerability is a pathway to innovation, creativity, and learning and growth. Speaking from the I perspective is a very powerful thing whenever we're having conversations like this. Allow yourself to tell your story. Don't tell anyone else's story without their permission. And lastly, to engage. I do want this to be not just me, the Kim Show. I do want to interact with you. So again, you'll have the chat as an option for you, and also you have you can speak. So I ask you to raise your hand and be recognized, and then I'll allow you to speak so that we can keep the flow going. But it's really nice when we get to interact with people on different levels. So stay in the conversation. Take responsibility for what you make things mean, meaning that we create our realities, right? And they are true and they're valid for us, but we have to go back to figure out, how did we make things mean? And take responsibility for that, because sometimes we forget we made it mean something, but it's not necessarily the truth. And we're going to unpack that as we move forward. Don't confuse listening with agreeing. When we start talking about how to facilitate these difficult conversations, that's one of the things that's going to come up. It might be why some people don't want to participate in conversations, because if they think that they're listening, that they're agreeing with you. And those two concepts are not mutually exclusive. Okay, so we're going to let go of being right and commit to the conversation of being heard. And that's a different kind of paradigm. We want to share air time. So there's a lot of you here. So I would like to hear or see something from the chat from at least everyone, but we don't want to monopolize around one person. We want to share that space and just be fully present and engaged with me, okay? So because I'm paranoid and I never know what's going on with internet, I have this big fear that I'll just get locked out of my session or something like that. And I don't know, but just in case I should get disconnected, here's the topic of the day. So discuss your most difficult or awkward conversation you've ever had to facilitate in the classroom, and then discuss the outcome. Should I, disappear, lose sound, whatnot? But we have protocols in place for that, okay? So I want to focus in on 4 things. First and foremost, that's on my mind. I don't know about you in the political and social atmosphere that we are in. I'm in high anxiety, and so I have cut off all my news because it's creating a lot of angst. And so I just needed to kind of calm down and do some a media fast, so to speak. But I want you to really think about the current and the future impact of the social and political climate on the classroom. Those of you who have been in the classroom know that it's happening, it shows up. How does it show up in your class, and how do you deal with it? And we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about a role of self-awareness in facilitating these types of conversations, because there's a phrase, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. There's things that you need to do prior to being able to facilitate these conversations. And there's also, we're going to talk a lot about strategies for preparing the space, but also just best practices in general for facilitating the conversations around difficult topics. So here are my first questions, and I have them all listed out, and we can tackle them in any way that we want to. But I'm going to invite you again to either use a chat or raise your hand to be recognized so that I can hear you speak. So here are the questions that I want to start with. What impact do you think the current social and political climate has or will have on the classroom? What are the challenges and or opportunities you see for students and faculty? What are your fears and what are your hopes? So when you can write that in the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can share your answer to at least one. I want to hear from a couple of people. So I have division and change. Okay. Ginjira, is that a fear and a hope? I think the political climate might polarize the classroom. Okay. Who's that? Jake. So Jake, we're going to talk about what that may look like in the classroom as well. Thank you, Janjira. So that was a fear and a hope. So the fear is division, the hope is change. Awesome. Thank you. I'm up here using my nonverbals like y'all are right here. Anyone else? Anyone like to speak, to share? So Yvette, my POV, people seem to be angry all the time. Okay, that's for the challenges today. Is that correct, Yvette? Okay, beautiful, thank you. And I know that this particular conversation is really focused in on faculty, but because we do have a variety of people here, I want you to think about your role because, yes, this is going to be happening in the classroom, but it's also going to start to develop or maybe even manifest in your particular departments or units. So begin to think about how that spills over as well. Fear equals silence, hope, openness. Nice. Yeah. Stephanie, the silence part is one of my fears. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. All right, Janae. I'm hopeful that this will serve as an opportunity for more open-minded conversations, but I fear touchy subjects will shut down the willingness to learn about uncomfortable topics. Thank you, Janae. Yes. So this is one of the big things. I will tell you over the summer, after the George Floyd incident, I got called to work with a university that was the faculty were trying to be proactive in addressing their student concerns and actually went to the students. They didn't realize the students were so angry and hurt that they started wanting to address the things that were going on in that particular department. And in that, the faculty took it upon themselves to have conversations. However, this is the skill set. There are many of us who facilitate these conversations. And there's things that you have to be mindful of before you take them on. And when I say it was a hot mess, it was a hot mess because, and when we get into the first part, if you have not already processed the information, it's going to be very difficult for you to navigate the conversation. And this goes back to what Jen and I'll unpack. Challenges, student voices will be silenced because they are misunderstood. Yes, thank you, Ginger. So y'all can continue writing and continue sharing, and hopefully we'll kind of scaffold and we'll go back to a lot of these things because there's going to be a lot of connectivity here. So thank you for those of you who missed. I don't see any hands raised to my knowledge. So don't let me check. Okay. So I said earlier, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. You know, how do you see or experience yourself? And then how do you think others see you? Because sometimes it's a different world, right? Have y'all been on Facebook lately where they say, okay, tell me these things about myself? It's a really weird kind of challenge, but it's very interesting. I haven't done it, but I've read through people. I'm a voyeur on Facebook. And it's a really interesting thing to understand who you are and who you are for people. I know a lot of people who have great self-awareness, and then there's some who aren't as self-aware. So being self-aware is very essential to facilitating these particular conversations. Furthermore, how does how you show up, your cultural packaging, impact how you interact with others? There are certain things, depending on who you are, male, female, black, white, tall, short, you're going to have to prepare for when dealing with students. Okay. One of the things that always comes up for me is, I read young. And so if I have older students, they tend to not want to take my class. And then I have this high-pitched, squeaky voice, right? So I have to, I find myself anyway, overcompensating for some things. And even as a Black woman, there are certain things that I have to prepare for that I always get with certain students. And so I have to be mindful that they're coming in with stereotypes and I'm coming in with stereotypes. So how do we take these out of the equation? Where do you speak from when you communicate with people? What personality comes out? I find that I've been teaching a lot like how I parent, and I don't know if that's a good thing or not. ask my kids. But I find that I do that a lot. And then sometimes I have to pull out that professor persona or the administrator. So who is speaking at any given time with any given topic? And then what are some of your blind spots? These are things you really don't know that you don't know until someone tells you or until you make a mistake. Okay. So you want to find out now before you make that mistake. But even if you make the mistake, it's how you deal with it and how you come to terms with what that may mean. And then what are your triggers? What are things that if a student says or does in class, or even a colleague says or does on the job, that will take you into another space that may not be as productive, right? So what are some, I'm going back to the chat to see, let's see. Cody, understanding communication, respecting our differences, and using the best parts of those differences to build something better. Beautiful. Assuming that is a hope. And then Yvette, I fear that emotions over touchy subjects remain barriers to communication. Yes, emotion is human, but it can be problematic. And then in the classroom, it all depends too on how you're framing these conversations. Is productivity the goal all the time? It all depends on how you're measuring productivity. The way that I frame conversations, particularly those that are considered difficult, and we're going to talk about that framing in a minute, really depends on, I always measure it by, did everybody get heard the way they wanted to be heard, right? As opposed to being right. And that those are some competing things when I evaluate faculty or when I train facilitators. These are things that I'm always seeing show up. So if you haven't already done so for your own sake, you really want to look at these questions and have answers to these questions, because when it comes to self-awareness, you want to know where you are on this spectrum. Okay. Again, those of you who've taken the foundations training are probably familiar with this model that was created by a couple of us. And so this model is just designed to kind of conceptualize where you may be in any given conversation or situation. You may be in a place where you're totally clueless. You have no clue that it's a thing that even exists, right? So you might be oblivious, clueless. If you've ever been around people who've never been exposed to certain things, you're going to find that a lot. And I'm seeing that a lot, particularly in my dual credit students, where they're like, that's a thing I never knew, right? And so it's sometimes a really great and powerful place to be. And we'll talk about that. Ignorance is lack of knowledge. Okay, you may know about it, but you don't know enough about it, and you've kind of made generalizations and you're standing in that space. Awareness is that next step where we're trying to get most of our students to get to where we should be as instructors, where we're aware of these things. But note too that there isn't really any action. It's still very passive. Then we have tolerance, which I argue that we've been, as a country, as a world, we've been at tolerance so long that it's no longer sustainable, right? So we're to the point where there's this so much going on that is detrimental to the quality of life. So putting up, that's what tolerance usually means to people, putting up with. No one really wants to be put up with, right? And I think earlier someone was talking about wanting to, what was it? It was Cody, understanding communication, respecting our differences. Tolerant is not respect, right? And it's not the end goal to social justice conversations or conversations regarding diversity, inclusion, and equity. That is not the end goal. And for so long in these conversations, it has been, we'll just put up with you, status quo. And we know that it's not sustainable, So when we get past tolerance is when the work really begins. Understanding means that you are engaging with people. You are not only engaging with them, but you're listening from a point where you're trying to understand how they are seeing the world. Denial is not engaging or pushing back actively on that information that they're giving you, all the stories, all the experiences. And then the appreciation part comes when you are able to, not literally, but step in their shoes. We'll talk about mirrors and windows. That's part of cultural responsive pedagogy, in which if you create those in class, you can create a appreciation for what people are going through or what they're experiencing. And then we get to acceptance, okay? Acceptance and agreement are not the same thing. You can accept something and not agree with it. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the point of the awareness continuum, and I like to use it with my students. I teach humanities, and so we deal with a lot of social justice. The theme is social justice typically. And whenever we get stuck in a conversation, I will ask them, where are you, or where do you think you are on the awareness continuum? Okay. And they're like, oh, I guess I'm just oblivious right now. And it's really helpful. It's like a map, because it tells you as a facilitator where you can move that student, or where you can move that student if they're stuck. And it's really good because you get to measure their own self-awareness as well. Kind of going back to this whole idea of cultivating self-awareness. You need to do the work that was on in terms of those questions that I asked earlier about yourself. How do you occur to yourself? How do you occur to other people? What are your fears and what are your hopes? Because if you are not dealing with that, you cannot be leading the conversation. And one of the things, that's why if you need professional development around these things, that I strongly encourage that. But as a facilitator, we always tell each other, do not process in front of the room. Because when you're teaching, it's your students, their opportunity to process, to move through the information. You are the guide. And if the guide doesn't know where to go, we're all in trouble. So you want to be able to do this work. When you speak to people and interact with them, do you share who you are? And I don't mean tell all your business. We don't need all of your business, but sharing the things that are really, that people would need to understand to really get your world. Right. One of the things that I share a lot with people is that I'm dyslexic, and severely dyslexic, but I'm brilliant. Right. And so there's a lot of people who know that story, but they understand that because of that, I always try to be the smartest person in the room, or the overachiever or whatnot. But people now, when they listen to me, they hear my heart. And so even if I mess up and say something off, they hear my heart, and it makes it easier. When people don't know you and you say something that can be considered difficult or controversial, that's when it goes astray. But when people know you, they will take time to walk it out. It's like, this is what happened. This is the impact. Okay. Ask for feedback from people. It's really great. We're trying to make the most out of this virtual world. And as a department chair, I have found a lot of joy in being able to observe classes online, because I can literally hide, by turning my camera off and kind of listening in. But also, it's really great to see what people are doing and getting a sense of how you can implement those things as well. But get feedback on what people think about you. I've finished the Engaged Learning Academy. Is that what it's called now, Michelle? I'm getting it. So, Yep. But I had such a great time having people being in the space with me and listening in and then giving me feedback, because I always think I'm crazy or not clear, right? And to see that feedback was very helpful. Okay. The other thing, how many of you know are familiar with the term code switching? Can anyone tell me what they think that means? Code switching. Oh, you live in code switching, Gingera? Yes. There's a wonderful book called Shifting, and it talks about the lives of Black women and how um, we shift, right? And this is anybody with multiple kind of identities. So code switching essentially is changing your thoughts, not necessarily your thoughts, your behaviors and your nonverbals and verbals, your communication to adjust to whatever audience that you're talking to. And we do this naturally. There are some natural kinds of power dynamics when there comes to code switching. Power dynamics, at least what the research says, is like women usually shift their behavior to men. Historically marginalized people would shift to the dominant group. Younger people shift to the older. Those kind of relationships that we tend to see through the master narrative. Okay. And what I'm asking you to think about is, when do you code switch? And do you do it naturally or do you do it intentionally? Because part of this self-awareness is being able, when we talk about cultural humility, you're usually the one in power. And when you recognize that and you shift to your student, because as instructors, I know for myself, we tend to leverage that power dynamic. Okay. In the face-to-face classroom, sometimes you can, sometimes you have professors who may just stand where the lectern is, in the computer, which creates a barrier and it creates a hierarchy, whether you know it or not. And then what comes available to you if you walk around the room, right? That's code switching. That's cultural humility. You're going to the students and you're saying that I'm part of you. This is welcoming. So you have to be mindful of how you are code switching and be more intentional about when you are doing it and when you are not. The research also says that people who have more power are less likely to shift, or people who perceive to have power are less likely to shift. Start thinking about when you shift. Okay. It's not a good or bad thing. It's what we do to survive. The way that I talk to y'all is not the way I'm going to talk to my kids, right? Or my husband or my supervisor. So it's just noticing that. Those of you who may teach English know that our students have considerable challenges, at least from our perspective, of dealing with audience, who the audience is. A lot of this has to do with on social media. You're everybody. Everybody's nobody. You don't have to shift, right? And so when it comes to the real world, we have to really articulate those personal and professional boundaries. What can and cannot happen in your classroom, what can or cannot happen, or what you will deal with in your particular workspaces. Okay. Any comments or questions about self-awareness? And it takes a lot of work. I've been a practitioner for over 20 years and I still mess up. But I'm humble about it in terms like, y'all, what is the correct word? What should I have said? Why, getting that information and intel. Anything else about self-awareness? When I talk to one of my friends in another way at work. Yes. Thank you, Alma. So how do you prepare the space? You need to be proactive, not reactive when having these conversations. And some of you may have classes in which these conversations, you already know which ones are going to be the hot button issues. And then some of us may have those conversations or those classes that we never know if something's going to pop off, right? Because technically anything could be controversial, right? So how do you typically enter the classroom space? How do your students enter the space? What rituals or practices do you have to create opportunities to connect with people? And then what rituals and practices do you have to ensure accountability and safety for both students and faculty? So what kinds of things are you doing? And you can answer any of these questions, any order, and then you can also talk if anybody wants to talk. Before going into a classroom, I typically I do meditation. I have to clear the space. So you remember how I started the conversation about the 3 words where you are is a great prompt. That's one of my favorite prompts to use in the class because it's quick and it makes you stick to 3 words and you get a sense of where people are. A lot of times when we start classes, we don't take time to connect. When we start meetings, we don't take time to connect, right? It is like go, go, go. And particularly because we're in this virtual space in which we're trying to work this work-life integration, we kind of go and go and go. There's less decompression time between meetings, right? I try to enter a classroom with an open mind. Yes. Yeah. You got to clean the slate, that intellectual sorbet, just clean it out, right? And then how are our students entering? They're probably coming from work or coming from another class or coming, sometimes it is that day for them where things are not going well. And how do you create the space? Before entering situation, classrooms, interviews, and appointments, I like some quiet time. Yes, I'm like that too. Yes. I always greet my class virtually or online and ask them how they are doing and show that I care about their well-being. Yes, I find that very important, Janae, right now more than ever, because many of our students are not doing well. They're not, and it's a really difficult time. And the fact that you ask, turn something, create something that wasn't there before. It's very valuable just to acknowledge somebody. Yeah, reading a book for fun for even a few minutes. Yes. Yes. So we all have our rituals. So going into the space, what you are preparing for, because you never know what you're going to get. Okay. I'm just kind of monitoring everything. Thank y'all for your patience. And as you keep writing, I'll keep responding to whatever you say in the chat. So here are some ways to prepare the space. And these can be utilized not only for the classroom, but also for your workspaces as well. My motto is be proactive, not reactive. I don't like surprises. Some people do. I don't. I'm a control freak. Don't surprise me, right? I like to be proactive. I like to think ahead of time. So if I'm doing a lecture about such and such, I'm going to prepare for those people who may be uncomfortable and find ways in which I will be able to support them, right? It has been difficult to separate life and class dynamic as a new instructor, balancing the idea of student struggles as well as getting the work done is difficult to navigate. Yes, how do you be compassionate and then maintain the academic rigor, right? And we've been asked as faculty to be compassionate, but what does that look like? And where's the line between compassionate and enabling? Yes, yeah, it's a hard line and we're all figuring it out together. And I think that's one of the things that you can do to dissipate some of the edge that comes with these conversations. It's like, I'm there too. I'm right here, right? I'm a big fan of disclaimers when it comes to calibrating student expectations. I have a whole slew of them because my class is about social justice issues, and people are naturally going to be grumpy about those things. And my cultural packaging, too, as being a Black woman, exacerbates it because it changes how people react. And this is what I mean by code switching. We all have biases, and I will tell you one of my biases is age. And so if I don't think I've ever had a boss who was younger than me tell me what to do. But when my kids say something in which it sounds like they're telling me what to do, I take issue with that. And so that's the way I'm kind of framing it in my mind. So we do not deny that we respond to people in different ways based on who they are. And this is what we do, right? I I shift different when it comes to men and women, when it comes to Black women and white women. And once we just kind of deal with that, and it's not a good or bad thing, it's just something to recognize and something to manage, then we understand that. Because I know when I'm teaching a class, if I'm teaching, and I don't really teach from the Western canon, my background is in ethnic literature and whatnot. And so I tend to bring in things that students aren't familiar with, and it's not uncommon for me to get a comment, oh, this is a Black class. And then my question to that, well, what does that mean? And why does that matter? Right? So you want disclaimers. And some of the things that I have in my disclaimer are my responsibility, my role, and what I'm supposed to do. I also to give them an out. Okay, so I have some stuff like this class is designed for full self-expression. We have a collective responsibility to respect each other. I do not tolerate verbal or physical attacks, kind of those things, kind of laying down the ground rules that's really important. And tell them what my role is. My role is to facilitate learning. My role is to create a space where people can be heard in a safe space, right? And safety and comfort are not mutually exclusive. Right. If there's a zombie apocalypse, we're all going to be safe in the attic, but we probably won't be comfortable. And learning is not comfortable. So I have to frame those things because sometimes these are very new topics for students. And then sometimes there are things that they don't understand why I'm talking about it here. So you have to justify it. Establish and consistently hold people accountable for the principles of engagement. So those principles of engagement that we went through at the beginning, I have in my syllabi. I restate for the first couple of weeks of school so that people get a hang of them. And I even ask them, does anybody have one to add? Because depending on the dynamic of your class, they may need to add something. Okay. And it's a social contract. And the reason why we call them principles, because it has a different ring than rules. Principles is basically there's in the background, there's this social contract. These are standards or things that we would like you to, and having those principles of engagement really does make a difference. I know for myself, because when I don't have them, it's harder to establish a ritual and practice of it. When I Okay, can y'all still hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure. There's some ringing sound going on. Okay, so you want to prime the space. So you want to make sure that you have done all the front loading, all the front work before you go into meeting with students. So you have to do the work on yourself, and then you have to do the work on the space, physical space, but also your the space that you're going to be creating for your students. Have a protocol for when there are moments of upset or loss of power. Okay. Does anybody know what I mean by moments of upset or So an example would be, and those of you who are typing, keep typing, and I'll make sure to acknowledge you. Example would be for this. Okay, y'all can still hear me though. This is weird. I told you technology, we can't trust it. Okay. I had a student, she had an issue with a TED Talk that I had them critique so that they can understand how thesis is used and how it can be built. And she emailed me, she said, I don't want to talk about, because basically the TED Talk was sex needs a new metaphor. So because we were studying language and how it could be limiting. And so she's like, I'm not going to look at this TED Talk. I don't want to read it, whatnot. I was like, that's fine. And then she's like, well, I want another assignment. I said, that's not going to happen. And one of the things that needed to happen was I had to have a conversation with her. I was like, well, what is it that, what is it that you think will happen if you read it or if you listen to it? But I just don't talk about these things. I said, well, do you remember what we had in this syllabus? If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. There's an out. I drop your 2 lowest grades, but this happened to be a very important activity because it was going to help them with something else. I always tell them this is not designed to offend you, but it's an opportunity for you to learn about these different things. And so one of the things that I said to her is I've had similar experiences, but I learned from them and I was very grateful. And I shared some of the stories regarding that. And she was very appreciative that I took the time. And she actually did well on the topic. And then she was like, I know why you assigned this. And I was like, yay, because you had to walk her through it. But the answer was not just like, the answer was to keep her in the conversation and allow her to kind of move through the discomfort, because she had the conversation that if I listen to it, it means I agree with it. And that is not where I was trying to get to. I was like, listen for the argument. And I sometimes I pick things that will not really upset people, but will take them out of their comfort zone, because that's when the most critical thinking comes out. Okay, and found a lot of power in that. And she was, and she's a wonderful student. And she's like, I get this. I get what you did it. And I was really happy with that, because at first I was like, oh my gosh, do I have to do this again? And it's very difficult when you're teaching things like art, because we are going to look at news. We are going to look at these different things, and you have to prepare yourself. And we have a lot of students who may not have been exposed to those things, but also there was an out. If you didn't want to do it, I wasn't going to force you, but there might be impact, right? That's why I have that policy built in there that says I'm going to drop your 2 lowest assignment grades because this will give you that opportunity. And she was, oh, that's what that was for. Yeah, that's there for you. And it's there for you for multiple reasons, not only that. So facilitation strategies for, did I go backwards? No, I went backwards. Okay. So best practice. Ooh. Okay. This is what I want. Okay, hold on. There we go. Facilitation strategies. Okay. Based on what you teach, what kinds of topics do you anticipate coming up in the classroom that are going to give you a run for your money? How do you define a difficult topic? Because that's one thing too, is difficult for who and how. So as a facilitator, I often have to pull myself back because I'm very comfortable with a lot of things. It doesn't faze me, but then I have to be mindful that for many of my students, this is new. For many of my students, they're going to hear something different. So I have to be very mindful and compassionate, considerate about where they are speaking from or where they're coming from for this topic. How do you typically deal with conflict or resistance? And then how do you create a space where everyone is heard? So those are the questions that are on the table. What are y'all been doing? What are some things that you do? What is a difficult topic for you? What are some things? Because sometimes too, there might be that elephant in the room that needs to be talked about. And I've been in situations where I've been observing, and it's clearly the elephant is not only in the room, it's sitting on all the desks, and the faculty member will disregard it. And I can see the students respond and be like, oh, how come this wasn't addressed, right? So what are those topics for you? What are your fears? What comes up when you see these particular questions? When I teach race, it's usually the most difficult topic. And because it's so difficult, I save it till the end, because I usually look at all the core identifiers. I used to just go in and straight race, and that was not working. People, I guess, needed to be eased in that. And of course, I have a certain level of comfort, right? And so after a while, it's like, okay, well, let me scaffold this and start with age and then work my way up to race. And it actually worked a little bit better when I did it like that. Okay, because I got the ease in, and then there's a pattern with all these different core identifiers that by the time we get the race, I could say, well, we talked about the same thing when we talked about ageism, so how does that not apply to this? And it was actually more effective to be able to move in that regard. I see people typing. It might not be for me. Yeah, there's some difficult topics for people. I would say a difficult topic for me, just to talk about, only because I don't have the language, happens to be on the LGBTQ spectrum and talking about it. There's so much going on there in terms of the scholarship and whatnot that and I tell my students, I'm a scholar of this. This is one of my weaker areas in knowing things. So I'm still getting a hang of the language. But please correct me. Race comes up in art appreciation. Yes. Of why are most artists white and male? Yes. Yeah. Abortion and incarceration? Yes. Yes. Oh, Stephanie, I just saw your stuff. I'm sorry, because everything keeps moving up. Loss of power, meaning people are feeling wrong. Because when you have these kind of conversations, you can't have conversations if you've already made people wrong. That's why people don't want to be in a conversation or have conversations about race, gender, class, etc. Because if you already made them wrong, why would they even have a conversation? Right? So you don't want to create a loss of power. You want to create a sense of accountability, though. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I try to start the semester by showing a broad variety of ethnicities of artists right off the bat. This way, when we get to European Renaissance, students don't feel like someone don't feel like someone they relate to has been left out. That's great. And we're going to talk about windows and mirrors in a minute. So the strategy for a lot of this work is to educate, engage, empower. Whenever you are facilitating conversations, and particularly if you have a student that says something that you would consider inappropriate, you want to first educate them. I have a lot of students who use the term or have abbreviated the terms people of color, and they say colored. It's in their papers, they say it in class, and I had to stop getting my head to do the little jerk thing and say, kind of stop and say, what was the term that you use? And not in an indicting way, but can you explain that? Because I didn't understand that they were abbreviating people of color. I was like, oh, well, do you know how that may land on other people? And they were like, no. Again, on the continuum, they were in oblivion. They had no clue that it wasn't appropriate, right? I said, well, if you say it to a group in this age group, they're going to probably hear it like this, and they're going to probably hear it like this, right? Or you allow the class to kind of join in and you say, does anybody know the connotation of this word, right? It's not that it's good or bad, it's just going to land differently, and you got to be responsible for the impact. I talked about creating mirrors and windows. So a window is an opportunity to see someone else's culture. Okay. A mirror is when they have an opportunity to see their own culture and themselves represented. So what activities or conversations do you have that create that opportunity for them to see themselves and to see other people? Because it's that back and forth that is going to allow them to be better able to be in conversations when they feel like they're represented. Avoid blame, shame, and guilt. You have to watch your language around that. So should you, could you, would you? If you hear that, dissipate it. Consider, I invite you, right? So those are some of the language that we're using to reframe conversations that can be looked at as difficult. Always ask questions. And that's my strategy, is asking questions. I had an instructor who was doing a lecture on Aztec art, and the student was asking, are you talking about Wawa Indian or Dot Indian? And it took me a while to get what that student was saying. And I was observing the faculty member. I was like, ooh, this is going to be good. What's he going to say? And he just stopped because he himself identified as Asian Indian. He just stopped. He took a breath and he asked her, because all the students were like, ooh. And he asked her, what do you mean? Can you elaborate? And is really sincere. She's like, yeah, we're talking about the Wawa. I said, well, we usually like to call ourselves this and this. Oh, is that what? I didn't know what the word was, right? And so you want to have them arrive at their own conclusions by giving them information. Holding people accountable. When they say something, tell them what the impact is. They're probably less likely to do it. Okay. And then trade in being politically correct for inclusive language. And what I mean by politically correct, correctness or political correctness is when you don't tell the truth and you kind of package it in a way that's very vague and not specific. Inclusive language is very specific, but it's designed to, again, create the mirror or the window effect. And do no harm. This is a great way to be able to delegate to people. And when you are dealing with a difficult situation, depending on your will and skill, and then who are you dealing with? There are some conversations you may not need to have in that moment at all, right? If someone is committed to being right, don't have that conversation. You're not going to move it, because the conversation or the goal should always be to be heard. So you have people who are high will and low skill, or high skill and low will, and it gives you a guide to be able to interact with them. So focus on what you are able to control, and what you can control is you and your development and your listening and opening up to students. You can still have high expectations and high support, which is very important. We do want to have high expectations, but a lot of times we have to provide them the support to meet those expectations. Focus on transformation, and not change. And what I mean by that, change is external. You know, if you've ever gone on a diet, you have to change your mindset. It's just not changing, your actions. You have to change the mindset to inform the actions. And lastly, you want to be authentic, but very compassionate. And you can be both.